The Yakuza are dying. Gen Zs are killing them. Now that sounds like a crazy thing to say. The Yakuza are, after all, one of the most infamous organized crime groups in the world. So how are they being killed by a bunch of phone-scrolling, TikTok-dancing kids, most of whom have the attention span of a fish and some haven't even finished high school? Well, I wouldn't say that Gen Zs are intentionally killing the Yakuza. They are sort of doing it by accident, though, at a time when the Yakuza are already weak. So this isn't first-degree murder, but more like manslaughter. The Yakuza's decline is evident from the numbers. At its height in the 1960s, the Yakuza had more than 180,000 members. That number is down to less than 20,000 at this point, and trending down still. But to explain how this happened, and what Gen Zs have anything to do with it, I need to reference the legal and historical context that led up to this. The Yakuza are Japan's most well-known organized crime syndicates, similar in function to the Italian mafia or the Mexican cartels, but with their own distinct cultural and operational differences. For example, the Yakuza have operated openly for much of their existence. They register businesses, maintain offices, and publish contact information. Many Yakuza members even carry business cards. They've also had a mixed reputation in Japan. To some, they seem like chivalrous outlaws, groups that, at least on the surface, protected the weak, upheld local order, and lived by strict moral codes. They even have a history of helping out their community at times of crisis, like how they helped to deliver supplies and with other disaster relief efforts during the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. This is probably why Japanese societies have partly tolerated their open operation for some time, but there is no denying that they do break the laws. Depending on the Yakuza groups, they may profit from extortion and loan sharking, to scams and political corruptions, to drugs and human trafficking, to even assault and murder. And as such, the Japanese government has steadily increased its crackdown on the Yakuza since the 1990s, passing laws such as the 1992 Anti-Boryokudan law, and intensifying their enforcement over time. Fast forward to today, most businesses are now forbidden from working with the Yakuza altogether. This has not only dried up many of Yakuza's revenue streams, but also made life practically difficult for Yakuza members, since they are blacklisted from businesses. For example, it is nearly impossible for Yakuza members to do simple things like opening bank accounts, renting apartments, or even getting phone plans. These legal crackdowns have significantly weakened the Yakuza, but it's not the only reason behind their decline. Along with this intensification of legal pressure is a shift in the economy of crime. If we look at the Yakuza from a business perspective, one of their long-standing competitive advantages has been violence. Now, in a stereotypical society, only the government has legal access to violence, and it presumably uses it for things like maintaining order, protecting borders, and so on. Other members of society typically don't have access to violence. Businesses, for instance, can compete in all sorts of ways: better products, cheaper services, clever marketing, but they can't physically attack each other. They can't use violence. But the Yakuza can, and that allows them access to business models and markets that normal business don't. They can go into things like illegal gambling and prostitutions and loan sharking and other black markets because they can use physical force. That has its own risks, of course, but all things considered, having access to violence has traditionally been quite profitable for the Yakuza. But the world has changed. We've now entered the digital age and what's called the knowledge-based economy. The most valuable assets today aren't physical. Rather, they are intangible, like information, ideas, patent, data, attention, and code. This shift has a profound effect on the economic value of violence, because violence can arrange atoms, but not bits. And as such, it has virtually no direct effects in the digital realm. And as it happens, the types of crimes that are most profitable in the digital economies are increasingly virtual rather than physical. Back in the day, you used to be able to punch people in the face and take their wallets, and that used to be profitable. But if you do that today, you'll probably just get a bunch of credit cards that will be locked the moment they are reported missing, and maybe a phone that you can't use without Face ID. Crimes like phishing scams, crypto fraud, online identity theft, ransomware attacks are becoming more profitable than robbing people at gunpoint. Hacking into a bank, for example, is more profitable now than robbing the bank because the most valuable things are now stored in the bank's servers rather than its vaults. And in this new economy, violence doesn't scale very well, and it loses its edge by the days as the world continues to digitize. So in many ways, the Yakuza has been playing catch-up with the time to either scale their existing digital operations or venture into new ones. However, it's not an easy pivot for an organization built on physical violence to start relying on business models of crime where violence isn't as much of a leverage. So it's fair to say that the Yakuza are on the ropes. The law is squeezing them out of society, and the economy has shifted from under their feet. They should have their hands full at this point, but there's one more problem: the Gen Zs. This is unexpected perhaps, but consequential nonetheless. In fact, Gen Zs could very well be the one to put the final nail in their coffin. The problem with Gen Zs is regarding recruitment, because for the life of them, the Yakuza can't seem to figure out a way to get this next generation of young criminals to join them. This is not just a PR issue. It's an existential threat. Because for any criminal organization to survive, it needs young people who are the muscles that do the dirty work in the short term and carry out the legacy in the long term. But that's not happening right now. So much so that the Yakuza are in the process of aging into extinction. More than half of the Yakuza are older than 50 years old at this point, with an average age of 54 as of 2023. And only about 5.4% of Yakuza members are currently in their 20s. Now, there are reasons why people in general are less interested in joining the Yakuza today, based on what we've discussed so far. For example, we mentioned that the Yakuza are heavily targeted by the government. To join the Yakuza is to be subjected to the same fate, and it's understandable why people don't want that. We also mentioned the dwindling value of violence in the digital economy of crimes. Therefore, there's less appeal to join the Yakuza in order to get access to violence, because violence is not that necessary to commit digital crime. But these reasons apply to everyone. There is a reason, however, that's uniquely relevant to Gen Z's disinterest in joining the Yakuza, and that has to do with culture. Japanese Gen Zs, like those of most parts of the developed world, are digital natives. They're very much used to having information and digital extensions of themselves online that are instantly accessible through the devices in their pockets. Most of them probably got their Instagram accounts before their driver's license. And as such, one can say that they are raised partly by the Japanese cultural environment, but also partly by the internet. As a result, they are a little different from their older generational counterparts. For example, they are more individualistic and value autonomy and flexibility. This marks a clear contrast with traditional aspects of Japanese culture that are more collectivistic and value group harmony, social cohesion, and established social norm. This contrast creates a generational tension that's observable across many aspects of Japanese society, but is especially pronounced in the world of crime. This is because the Yakuza is deeply rooted in traditional Japanese culture. It is collectivistic, where each member is expected to have absolute loyalty to the group and put the well-being of the Yakuza organization above their own. It also has a strict hierarchy and expects total obedience to superiors and suppresses individuality. But that's an environment that Gen Zs find suffocating. This includes the Gen Z's criminals. These young criminals want to assert their individuality. They want to express themselves and their opinions, but they can't do that if they join the Yakuza. Many of them are also more entrepreneurial and want the freedom to experiment and make mistakes and learn from them. But the Yakuza demands perfection and hates mistakes. There's even a ritual called yubitsume, where you cut off your fingers as an apology for making serious mistakes. Gen Zs probably like their fingers as much as anyone, so they're not super stoked about that. And above all, Gen Z criminals want to commit crimes, and they want to do it right away. In the Yakuza, new members are typically required to endure long periods of low-status apprenticeships, during which they perform mostly menial tasks. So if Gen Zs join the Yakuza, they'll probably be bowing 20 times a day and serving tea for years before they can begin to contribute to real criminal projects in any significant ways. For a generation that are used to instant gratification, this is probably too long of a wait for their attention span to handle. Additionally, unlike the Yakuza who have to play catch-up with the digital economy, Gen Zs are born into it. What feels foreign to the Yakuza feels just like home to the Gen Zs. So instead of joining the Yakuza and help them catch up, Gen Zs probably prefers the faster route of just doing it themselves. They're thinking, why would I need the Yakuza? I have a smartphone and I've got Wi-Fi at home. The ChatGPT subscription is only $20 and DeepSeek is free. If I want to commit digital crimes, I'd rather do it with my college roommates than with these old people who just want to cut all my fingers every time my code doesn't work. Now, it's not like Gen Z criminals all operate alone. They still commit organized crimes, but the way they organize is completely different. There's a new term coined by Japan's National Police Agency called Tokuryu. It describes a new kind of organized criminal phenomenon that started happening in the last few years. It consists mostly of young people and seems to be filling the power vacuum left behind by the declining Yakuza. The word Tokuryu combines tokume, which means anonymous, and ryudo, which means fluid. And that name is quite fitting. The Tokuryu groups have no rigid hierarchy, no lifelong loyalty, no rituals. Many of their members don't even know each other. Instead, they're recruited for specific jobs or tasks on an ad hoc basis, almost like gig economy before crime. Tokuryu recruit mostly online and operate through encrypted messaging apps and social media platforms. This allows a degree of flexibility in their structure and some anonymity for their members that make them quite elusive to law enforcement. And it's easy to see why Gen Z criminals prefer the Tokuryu over the Yakuza. In fact, Tokuryu's recruitment pitch is so on brand for the Gen Z stereotype that it almost looks like a parody. No rules, no commitment, no delayed gratification. It just sign up online, show up, do the thing, get paid, and fuck off. It's almost like you can just Uber Eat, Tinder swipe, and TikTok scroll your way through a career in crime. Now, in case this is starting to sound like a good side hustle at this point, I should say, please don't go join the Tokuryu. Because, well, it's illegal, first of all, and secondly, that's kind of the whole trick. Tokuryu uses this curated messaging around quick cash and low commitment as a bait to recruit new members, sometimes specifically targeting unsuspecting youth who are looking for a quick buck online. These are called yamibaito, or dark part-time job in Japan. And they're almost like a gateway drug for crimes. Once you're in, it can become hard to leave. You might get hooked by it, or some groups might use blackmail or threats to keep you in the game. So what started as a one-off gig can turn into a full-blown trap. In any case, the Tokuryu are winning the recruitment game and poised to replace Yakuza as the dominant force of organized crimes in Japan. Tokuryu's arrest outpaced that of Yakuza last year, for example, with more than 10,000 people arrested linked to the Tokuryu and only about 8,000 linked to the Yakuza. Now, one of the things that make the Gen Z problem so frustrating for the Yakuza is that in a way, this isn't an enemy that they can fight. The Yakuza can fight the police, they can fight a rival gang, but how do you fight an enemy that simply doesn't care about you? How do you fight a generation who are basically ignoring you and effectively ghosting you to death? Well, you can't. In fact, the only available strategy for the Yakuza at this point seems to be, if you can't beat them, join them. For instance, some Tokuryu groups are suspected of sharing profits with the Yakuza, suggesting that they might be working together to some extent. There's also one prominent Yakuza group that got rid of their head office entirely, and the police doesn't know where they relocated to. So one of the theories is that they went online completely, seeking to operate in a similar fashion as the Tokuryu. Now, this report is only from a few days ago at the time I'm recording this, so no one knows what's really happening yet. And the whole Tokuryu phenomenon is quite new in general, so it remains to be seen how it will all play out in the end. In any case, at this time, the Yakuza seems to begin to take a back seat, while the Tokuryu are slowly becoming the main driver of organized crimes in Japan. And some Yakuza group might even be proactively reinventing themselves into Tokuryu in order to operate better in the current criminal landscape. Now, at the end of the day, Yakuza and the Tokuryu are both criminal organizations, so one might not have too much empathy for them, nor am I trying to make you feel bad for the Yakuza or any criminal organizations. But there is a deeper point I'm trying to make here with this story of crime. Crime is an extreme expression of society. As such, it could magnify dynamics that are subtle and opaque in daily life and make them more visible and easier to observe. This tension between the newer generation and traditional values doesn't only exist in the world of crime. It's everywhere. We can see this at work, for example, where Gen Zs are challenging the traditional Japanese salaryman work culture. We can also see this in dating, where Gen Zs are going against the traditional model of marriage and family. We can partly observe this in the plummeting birth rates across the world as well. So it's fair to say that Gen Zs are not just ghosting the Yakuza. Rather, they're sort of doing this to everybody. They ghost work, they ghost families. In a way, they're ghosting the entire future of humanity by not having kids. And they're probably ghosting each other at this point, given the high rate of loneliness in this generation. Now, I'm joking with this ghosting analogy. I am Gen Z, so I'm allowed to do this, I think. But jokes aside, the reality of each of these issues are much more complex. Working, dating, family, birth rates, each of these is its own rabbit hole that I won't be able to fully explore in this video, but I hope they show the breadth of this generational tension. I'm not in a hurry to make moral judgment about this though, and I'm not calling them good or bad, because generational tension is a human constant. It's a tale as old as time. It's quite common throughout human history for the next generation to be a little different from the older one, and this has been one of the forces that pushed cultures to change and evolve. So it's not surprising that Gen Zs are different from millennials. What is perhaps surprising is the magnitude of this difference and the rate at which it happened. This is probably in part due to how fast the world has changed. Most Gen Zs were opted into a massive psychological experiment at an early age that they did not consent to. And most of them grew up with instant access to all of human knowledge all the time through this cybernetic extension called smartphones and curated by social media algorithms. And this is only going to accelerate for the next generation who are currently growing up with generative AIs. So I don't know how all this will turn out in the end. We'll see, I guess. But I do hope that this analysis of the world of crime has been a useful case study with which to look at generational tension in other aspects of life. I hope it's helped you form a more nuanced opinion. And if you've watched till this point, I will be interested in your opinions and reactions to all this as well. So let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in how this generational tension play out in Japan's work culture, I made this video exploring that.